Reading through the Bible in one year, January 14th, Genesis 15, Matthew 14, Nehemiah 4, and Acts chapter 14. After these events, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Now, this is the Abrahamic covenant. It is probably one of the most important pieces of scripture in the entire Bible. This lays out how it will be for the not just the Israelite people who are the descendants of Abram, but also for all Christians moving forward. This is supremely important. Let's go. So the word of the Lord came to Abram now in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. What is God requiring of him that he does? Nothing. But Abram said, Lord God, what can you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Abram continued, Look, you have given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house will be my heir. Now the word of the Lord came to him. This one will not be your heir. Instead, he who comes from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look at the sky and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, Your offspring will be that numerous. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Again, we're going to come up to this later as we go through Romans and other pieces of scripture later on down the road. But what is it that Abram had to do to obtain this righteousness? What is it that he had to do to obtain any of these blessings that God is promising to him? Did he have to be a good person? No. Did he have to obey a long set of rules or laws? No. Did he have to do anything at all? No. All he's been doing this whole time is believing God. God said, you need to move out of where you are. And he took all of his stuff and left. He went into a new land. And he split up between himself and his nephew. And God said, whatever side you choose, I will cause it to prosper. It didn't matter which one he chose. Then he went into that land. He was a little bit unfaithful in the way that he treated his wife, even though he had been promised that he would survive and that God would give him offspring through his wife. So both of them would have been fine. He had a little bit of a small foible in that, but he still trusted in God for all of it. And God blessed him. Even now, what does he have to do? Nothing. And God is promising to be his shield. He is promising to be his, to give him a great reward. And all he has to do is believe God. That's it. There's no long list of anything he has to do. There's nothing he has to keep for the rest of his life. In fact, in Romans 9, where Paul makes the point that the Israel of God isn't the genetic descendants of Abram, but those who are following after the faith of Abram, who believe as Abram did. I say Abram because later he's Abraham. He's not Abraham yet, not to us in the story. So that's what's happening. And Abram knows that God has promised him he's going to have, more children than he can count. But he's like, look, I'm old. I'm 90 years old at this point, or almost 90 by this point. And his wife is 80 and he doesn't have any children. And he's worried about that. He's like, I don't know how much longer I can go. And that's the reason why he's asking these questions. He's not asking them in unbelief. He's saying, I don't have a child yet. How is this going to work? And that's why we see in verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, he trusted in him, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, this is God now speaking, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. Is he going to own any of it in his life? No, he's only going to own the plot of ground that he's going to use for a grave. But it's for his children that come after him, for those who follow in the faith of Abraham. But he said, Lord, how can I know that I will possess it? And he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Now this sounds weird, but this is the normal process you go through in a covenant, right? So he brought these all to him, cut them in half, and laid the pieces opposite each other. But he did not cut the birds in half. Birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. And as the sun was setting, a deep sleep came over Abram, and suddenly great terror and darkness descended on him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, your offspring will be resident aliens, sojourners, for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and they will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation where they serve, and afterward they will go out with they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. He's not promising that he's going to get anything in this age or this time. He's saying this is going to happen to your descendants, as in you will still have these same descendants. In the 4th generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. This is showing that God is even judging the nations surrounding them, those in Canaan, and God is allowing them to fill up the measure of their wrath before he sends the Israelites on them to destroy them. When the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your offspring, from the brook of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River, the land of the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hethites, the Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. It's the same Jebusites from which Jerusalem comes. Now, there's a little bit of weirdness here. Like, why did he take animals and cut them in half and keep animals away from eating them? Well, all of this is because the animals that, the way a covenant is brokered between two people is you take animals and you cut them in half and you separate them and you agree that if you break that covenant, well, then may you be destroyed as those animals are destroyed. And it's actually for both people to go through. If I made a covenant with you, and if we lived in this time, we would both take, say, a sheep or a goat, and we would cut them in half, and then we would both walk through them together. That way, if I broke the covenant with you, then you could do the same to me and my descendants. And if you broke the covenant with me, then I could do the same to you and your descendants. Because this was a covenant between us that both of us would keep our word on this. But who is the one who walked down between the animals? It was God. Abram never walked down with God. God was the one who did the walking the whole time. And that was the point being made. God is the one making the promise, and God is the one saying, if this should ever happen, that I would violate my covenant with you, not that you or your people would violate it with me, but if I would violate my covenant with you, then may I be destroyed. This is called a covenant of grace. Later on, we're going to read about the Mosaic covenant, which is a covenant of works, where the people are told you must keep all of my commandments. And if you keep all of my commandments, then I will do all of these wonderful things for you. Yet if you do not keep my commandments, then all of these horrible things will befall you. And that is a promise from God. And all the people agreed and said, yes, we will do that. And they were bound to this covenant by circumcision. And they were covered with blood from an animal that had been slaughtered for that purpose, to tell them that they will be destroyed. They will be killed if they don't abide by this. And they all agreed and said yes. And then immediately afterward, they started revolting against God. So he did what he said he would do. But that is called a covenant of works. You must perform works to obtain that covenant. But this covenant with Abraham, or Abram at this time, has none of those things. Why? Because it is God who is giving it willingly to Abram. And as we read through Romans chapter 9, it is carried over for those who have kept historically, even in the Old Testament, the faith of Abraham. And in today's age, it is Christians who continue in faith, trusting in God to do what he said he would do. This is that faith that saves. This is why this is such an important thing to go through. All right, let me go and pull up the rest of the notes here for you. All right, let's move on to Matthew 14. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus. This is John the Baptist, he told his servants. He has been raised from the dead, and that's why these miraculous powers are at work in him. For Herod had arrested John, chained him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, since John had been telling him, it is not lawful for you to have her. Though Herod wanted to kill John, he feared the crowd, since they all regarded John as a prophet. When Herod's birthday celebration came, Herodias' daughter danced before them and pleased Herod, and he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked, even up to half his kingdom. That's the statement. And prompted by her mother, she answered, "Give me John the Baptist's head on a platter." And though the king regretted it, he commanded that it be granted because of his oath and his guests. I mean, he doesn't want to suffer wrong from the people that are there at the party, because then he would be a liar. Can't have that. So he sent orders and had John beheaded in the prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. Then his disciples, this is not Jesus' disciples, but John the Baptist's disciples, came, removed the corpse and buried it, and went and reported it to Jesus. When Jesus heard about it, he withdrew from there by boat to a remote place to be alone. When the crowds heard this, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw the large crowd and had compassion on them. He didn't have to help them. I mean, he was mourning his friend. And really his cousin, I think. I think it's cousin. Anyway. So what had happened? Well, would it be uncle? I don't know. I'm not good with genealogies and all that. Anyway, regardless, so he's mourning John the Baptist's death, and he doesn't have to help the people, but he chooses to. He has grace on them. He had compassion, and he healed their sick. When evening came, the disciples approached him and said, "Well, this place is deserted, and it is already late. Send the crowds away so that they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves." "They don't need to go away," Jesus told them. "You give them something to eat." "But we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish here," they said to him. "Bring them here to me," Jesus replied. Then He commanded the crowds to sit down on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed them. And he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate and was satisfied. They picked up 12 baskets full of leftover pieces. Now those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children, so probably closer to 7,500 or even more. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After dismissing the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Well into the night, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat was already some distance from the land, battered by the waves because the wind was against them. Jesus came toward them walking on the sea in the very early morning, and when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. Well, immediately Jesus spoke to them. Have courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Lord, if it is you, Peter answered him, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. And climbing out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught hold of him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind immediately ceased. Then those in the boat worshipped him and said, "Truly you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they came to shore at Gennesaret. When the men of that place recognized him, they alerted the whole vicinity and brought to him all who were sick. Again, this is why he was telling the people, don't tell anyone what I've done for you, because eventually it would get to the point where everyone would recognize him and he couldn't, walk among the crowds. And they begged him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment, the edge of his robe, and as many as touched it were healed. That's how much faith they had that Jesus could help them. Let's move on to Nehemiah chapter 4. When Sanballat, the Horonite, heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious. And he mocked the Jews before his colleagues and the powerful men of Samaria and said, "What are these pathetic Jews doing? Can they restore it by themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they ever finish it? Can they bring these burnt stones back to life from the mounds of rubble?" Then Tobiah the Ammonite, who was beside him, said, "Indeed, even if a fox climbed up on what they are building, he would break down their stone wall." Listen, our God, for we are despised. Make their insults return on their own heads, and let them be taken as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt, or let their sin be erased from your sight, because they have angered the builders. So we rebuilt the wall until the entire wall was joined together up to half of its height, for the people had the will to keep working. When Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, the Ammonites, and Ashdodites heard that the repair to the walls of Jerusalem was progressing, and that the gaps were being closed, they became furious. So we prayed to our God and stationed a guard because of them day and night. In Judah it was said, "The strength of the laborer fails, since there is so much rubble. We will never be able to rebuild the wall." Our enemies said, "They won't realize it until we are among them, and then we can kill them and stop the work." When the Jews who lived nearby arrived, they said to us time and again, "Everywhere you turn, they attack us." So I stationed people behind the lowest sections of the wall, at the vulnerable areas, and I stationed them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I made an inspection, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the great and awe-inspiring Lord, and fight for your countrymen, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and homes. When our enemies heard that we knew their scheme and that God had frustrated it, every one of us returned to his work on the wall, or to his own work on the wall. From that day on, half my men did the work, while the other half held spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers supported all the people of Judah who were rebuilding the wall. And the laborers who carried the loads worked with one hand and held a weapon with the other. Each of the builders had his sword strapped around his waist while he was building, and the one who sounded the ram's horn was beside me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is enormous and spread out, and we are separated far from one another along the wall. Whenever you hear the sound of the ram's horn, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we continued the work, while half the men were holding spears from daybreak until the stars came out. At that time, I also said to the people, let everyone and his servants spend the night inside Jerusalem, so that they could stand guard by night and work by day. And I, my brothers, my servants, and the men of the guard with me never took off our clothes. Each carried his weapon, even while washing. Let's go to Acts 14. In Iconium, they entered, this is Paul and Barnabas now, the Jewish synagogue, as usual, in the normal way that they do, and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks, Gentiles, believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they stayed there a long time and spoke boldly for the Lord, who testified to the message of his grace by enabling them to do signs and wonders. You like that? The Jews were making it very hard for them, attacking them and trying to get people to assault them. So what did they do? Did they run away? No. They hunkered down. They're like, no, we're going to be here for a while. And they stuck around even longer, speaking boldly for the Lord. But the people of the city were divided, some siding with the Jews and others with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat and stone them, well, they found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian towns of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding countryside. And there they continued preaching the gospel. In Lystra, a man was sitting who was without strength in his feet and had never walked. So from his birth, he had lame feet. And he had been, lame from birth. He listened as Paul spoke, and after looking directly at him and seeing that he had faith to be healed, Paul said in a loud voice, "Stand up on your feet." And he jumped up and began to walk around. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, this is mirroring what we saw take place at the Beautiful Gate in Jerusalem, remember? Someone who everybody had known had been lame from birth, probably had been a beggar in the same area the whole time. Well, now he has been healed. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Well, Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the town, brought bowls and wreaths to the gates because he intended, with the crowds, to offer sacrifice to them. The apostles, Barnabas and Paul, tore their robes when they heard this and rushed into the crowd, shouting, "People, why are you doing these things? We are people also, just like you. We proclaim good news to you that you turn from these worthless things of the Greek gods to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. In the past, he allowed all the nations to go their own way, although he did not leave himself without a witness, since he did what is good by giving you rain from heaven in fruitful seasons and filling you with food and your hearts with joy. That's called natural revelation. We'll get to that in the beginning of Romans chapter 1. And even though they said these things, they barely stopped the crowds from sacrificing to them. I love this. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and when they had won over the crowds, they stoned Paul to death and dragged him outside of the city, thinking he was dead. After the disciples gathered around him, he got up and went into the town. The next day, he left with Barnabas for Derbe. You don't stone somebody just a little bit. You stone them until they are dead. And they stone quite a few people. In this time, they know when somebody is alive and when they are dead. It's not like he got up with pain. God had healed him and restored him to health. Paul refers to this later and tells you about the time that, somebody he knows, he doesn't talk about himself directly, went to the third heaven. What's the third heaven? Well, the first heaven is the air above us. The second heaven is the place where the stars are. The third heaven, that's where God lives. After they had preached the gospel in that town and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, to Iconium, and to Antioch, strengthening the disciples there by encouraging them to continue in the faith and by telling them it is necessary to go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. Not that you have to do a bunch of things to cause yourself hardship, but that, don't worry, it'll come. When they had appointed elders for them in every church and prayed with fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. They passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia, and after they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Italia. From there they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work which they had now completed. After they arrived and gathered the church together, they reported everything God had done with them, and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And they spent a considerable time with the disciples. And that is all the notes for now. God willing, we'll be back tomorrow. Behold, the word of the Lord.